National 5 pupils. This is the first in a series of lessons on population. Across the next few videos I'm going to deal with these 4 questions. These are the 4 areas you need to know for the exam: population density and distribution, population pyramids, demographic transition, and development indicators. This is lesson 1, and in it I'm going to give you a bit of background and some key terms that you need. So if you're taking notes, population unit is your title. And here are some of the key terms that you need to know. The first is the birth rate. It's the number of live births per 1,000 population. So for every 1,000 people we have in the UK, this is the number of babies born to that 1,000 people. The death rate's kind of the same. It's the number of deaths that take place for every 1,000 people in the country every year. So if the number is high, that means we have a high death rate, and if it's low, we have a lower death rate. The same with birth rate. And here's infant mortality. This is the third of the key terms that you need to know before we can really make any headway at all in this unit on population. This is the amount of deaths underneath 1 year old. So of the every 1,000 babies that are born and that live, this is the number of deaths that take place before that baby reaches 1. Okay, make sure you've got a note of those key terms. Now, on this screen I'm going to play you a short video and talk you through it to give you a bit of broader background about what we're talking about when we discuss population. On the screen in front of you, you can see a map of the world and a timeline along the bottom. Modern humans have been around for about 200,000 years, and in the last 100,000 years, which you can see along the timeline, we have spread from Africa, where we first evolved, around the world. The population of Earth was probably less than 1 million people for this whole period of time. We would have been very spread out, small numbers of small groups or tribes moving around the world. By the time we invented farming, we could make our food supply more reliable, so the population did rise, but nonetheless it remained very low. So now we're focusing on a timeline that starts at 1 AD and goes to the year 2000. Each dot on the map represents 1 million people. And you can see along the bottom of the graph there's a line being created. So by 100 years AD, there were 180 million people on the planet. Of course, these are estimates. During the times of the Roman Empire, the early Han Dynasty in China, the growth of the Indian Empire, which you can see coloured on the map, there were less than 200 million people living globally. Some parts of the world had yet to be inhabited at all by human beings. Now, it's important to remember that at 500 years, as you can see on the timeline after the birth of Christ, there are very few human beings, but we are at this point well within the written record of human history. Here in 600 AD we have the birth of Islam. So we're well within relatively recent human history. Coming up to 1,000 years ago, we encounter the first examples of disease affecting our populations, with the smallpox affecting Japan and some of Asia. And as you'll see as we move into the 1300s, the Black Death has an impact upon global population. But a big question is why is the line so low? Why are there so few people? And that's because for all of this stretch of history you're seeing play out in front of you, you stood a very low chance of surviving your own birth. basically. Infant mortality was very, very high. Many babies did not survive their first year. Also, if you did survive your first year and then grew into an adult, there was lots of disease, lack of sanitation, and frankly, the world was very dangerous. And there's the Black Death just happening there on the screen in front of you. And as a result, the population as a total could not grow because babies did not survive, and those people who did survive had low life expectancies. Now, as we move into the 1700s, there are improvements to how we farmed food, and therefore food supplies became more reliable, and you can see that the global population begins to tick upwards, just gradually. As we move into the 1800s, the industrial era meant that we were able to produce far more food, clothing, and most importantly, advances in science and medicine meant that things like soap became freely and easily available. By 1900, we were on the verge of inventing antibiotics. By 1945, they were invented, and you can see the impact that that has on global population. Put simply, babies were surviving their births more, and adults were living longer. Let's focus on that last part of the graph. What's happening from the year 2015 onwards? Well, we think that the global population will peak at about 11 billion people. At the current time, we think there's about 7.5 billion people. In 1950, your average woman was having 5 babies. By 2100, we think that it will be less than 2 babies. So our birth rates are falling. So, though the population is now very, very high, it cannot keep on getting bigger. This screen summarises the overall trend. It took about 200,000 years for our population to reach 1 billion people, and only 200 years to reach 7 billion. Some key facts are down at the bottom here, and you should note those down. Okay. This is a last important point, I think, to pause on before I progress with the rest of the lesson. The number of people on the planet is the number one reason that we face many of the geographical crises that we do face in the current era. For example, climate change is very much something that is controlled by humans and influenced by humans. But it is the sheer number of humans doing the polluting that is the difficulty. Cars, for example, do create air pollution, but it's the fact that there are 7 billion people and that we have cars to move all of those people around that creates the problem. One car isn't a problem. Several 100 million of them on the face of the planet is a problem. The scale at which we cattle farm and food and plant farm also means that we are polluting on a scale that is growing ever more every year. So the total population of Earth is one of the biggest challenges to face our species, and controlling populations is something that we as governments and countries around the world are going to have to face up to. Okay, so that's a little introduction for you. The population of Earth is currently about 7.5 billion. It's likely to grow to 11 billion, and that is because the birth rates and the death rates the death rate has dropped and the birth rate has risen. And as a result, more babies are surviving and fewer people are dying. So the overall population has grown. Okay, look at this graph. graph. This graph simplifies the story we just saw in the video. In blue, you can see the overall population of Earth increasing from 1760 to 1940 through year 2000 to 2015 when this graph was made. I'm speaking to you in 2019 and there's about 7.5 billion people. But you can see that not very far into your own lifetime, what the populations of Earth will be. And you can see that the predictions we're talking about, these are quite well informed predictions. These are not guesses. The reason that the blue area of the graph is gradually curving like this, it's not just growing up and up and up and up and up. The reason that we are starting to see a slowdown in the world's population growth is because of this red line. And this red line indicates the speed, the growth rate of the world's population. What's happening is around about 1980, when the world's population was growing faster than at any point in its history, we started to put measures in place. That means we took steps to slow down the growth of population. So around about this time in history, between 1960 to 1980, we started to make access to things like contraception and family planning far more globally available, and this has had the impact of slowing birth rates around the world right down. And the birth rate has changed from globally about 2% to 0.1% in that period of time. So another question you might ask here is, okay, so you're telling us that the birth rate has come down in the last few decades, and it will continue to fall. Why then does the population continue to grow? Even if it's growing a little more slowly, why does it continue to grow? And the reason that it's continuing to grow is because even though we're having fewer babies, the adults that those babies grow into are living longer and longer. Average life expectancies have gone up and up and up and up. And indeed, for me, speaking to you now, I'm 38 years old. I was born in 1981. What this means is that you, listening to this as a school pupil, have a longer life expectancy average than my generation. On average, your generation can expect to live slightly longer than mine. And the generation that follows you could expect to live slightly longer again. This image shows you a different way of understanding how populations are growing, because all you need to have really understood here, aside from the three key terms, birth rate, death rate, and infant mortality rate, is that the world's population is growing very quickly, and it will continue to do so. And that means that we have important questions to ask ourselves about how do we provide resources for all of these people? How do we provide the food necessary, for example, or the housing, or the jobs? This shows you a timeline progressing across the top at 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020, etc. And it shows you the total world population by continent. Notice where the major areas of growth are. Up until around about the year 2000 to 2010, the major area of world growth was in Asia, where China has over 1 billion people and India has over 1 billion people living within the borders of their own countries. However, look at what happens post-2010. Africa is now the fastest rising area of population growth in the world, and by 2050, 60 or 70, you can see that it's starting to rival Asia. Now, if the projections are true, that Africa catches Asia up by the year 2100, which, believe it or not, by the way, some of you listening to this might actually live to see, this presents us with a really serious set of problems. How are we going to provide all of those African nations with food, water, housing, security, medical care, prevention from disease, etc., etc.? This is genuinely a global problem, and not one isolated to individual countries. You can see, for example, the North American governments face a situation where, by the end of this timeline, they need to plan ahead, and 80 years from now is not really that long to plan ahead for having a total population of 500 million. Just watch the numbers, you'll see. North America has a projected population of 491 million people, just shy of 500 million. And that's in 80 years' time. They need to plan for housing and schooling and food and healthcare for all of those people. Of course, we should be more concerned about the developing countries in the world, where they already lack the necessary funding to make that happen. This graphic shows you how global cities are changing. Not only are we having increased lifespans, not only are we reducing gradually the birth rate, but still it only takes every adult couple around the world to have one baby for the population to increase by half. But also, the vast majority of people in the world are increasingly wanting to live in cities. And by 2020, it is almost true to say that half of the world's population lives in a city. By 2050, this will certainly be the case, and in fact it will be more than half. The size of the circle you can get a gauge for from the key here, and the number of cities that are approaching the 40 million citizen size is a little bit scary if you look at where they are concentrated. Okay, so there's some context for you. The population of Earth is growing. It will continue to grow for the rest of this century. The reasons for this are that our life expectancy, our death rate, our life expectancy is greater, meaning the death rate has fallen. Our birth rate has fallen, but so has our infant mortality rate, and therefore very few babies die in their first year. Almost all of the babies that are born do survive into adults, and those adults go on to have very long lives. As a result, the overall population of Earth is still rising. We've also learned that much of the rise in population is in developing countries and developing parts of the world that have less security, and that is something that should concern us all. And we've seen also that many of those people globally around the world, whichever country you're in, are choosing to live in cities. So our urban spaces are going to feel this pressure more than the rural. A final point is, of course, at the bottom of all of this, at the base of all of this, we need to consider if we are indeed living in a world with 11 billion people by the year 2100, which is within your natural lifetime if you are 15 years old right now and listening to this, well, how are we going to supply food, healthcare, clothing, housing, employment, and also, those are the basic things. What about the nicer things in life? Just entertainment and a good quality of life to all of those people. This is genuinely a global challenge, and where you see in geography or on the news or on TV global challenges facing the people, facing different countries around the world. For example, climate change. For example, plastics pollution. Those problems do not sit in isolation. The reason there's so much plastics pollution is because there's so much pressure on the environment by so many humans. The reason climate change has gotten so bad so suddenly and so quickly is because of the sudden explosion in the world's population. For every one of those humans, we produce pollution to fuel their lifestyle. Okay. So that's lesson 1. Our next lesson going to be on population density, and I'll take you through all of the notes for that and the model answers too. Okay, see you then.